So, a few months ago, I got into an argument in the Instagram comments about how we need to go back and build traditional architecture again. And I get it. For people that don't have that much architectural education, I completely understand where they're coming from. If you go out and you see these beautiful old buildings, and then you go back in your hometown and you look at a bunch of ugly, gray, boring office buildings, you can start to get an idea that, what happened? Why did we stop building beautiful? But the reality is that the history of architecture is a lot more complicated than we went from building pretty buildings to ugly buildings. There is way more historical context and reason behind the way we build the way we do. And so I decided to sit down and make this video as kind of an explanation of why and where we are right now. So, why don't we build like this anymore? Now, you might have heard people say, modern architecture is soulless. We need to reject modernity and embrace tradition, or that they don't make them like they used to. And if you're active online, you may have seen these types of posts that claim that modern architecture is a stain on society and that we need to go back to the way things were. So, in this video, we'll cover the reasons why the architecture of today is so different from the architecture of the past, why traditional architecture is such a contentious topic, especially in today's America, and reasons that we should and shouldn't build like we used to. So, to start things off, go through a brief history lesson. Architecture is made up of basically two things: sticks and rocks. Rocks. Essentially, there are two forces that define what materials can do: compression and tension. Compression is when a material is forced together, and tension is when a material is pulled apart. And so, some materials are better at being compressed, and some are better at being pulled apart. And the goal of architecture is to create inhabitable space for humans. Duh. But people value certain things. Namely, they like light, and especially natural light. They like protection from the elements. They want thermal stability and open space. And thus, the pursuit of architecture throughout history is the pursuit to maximize these elements. We want bright spaces, we want to be enclosed, we want to be safe, and we want to have kind of an open space. And throughout history, people have tried to accomplish that to the best of their ability. So the earliest structures made the most of limited materials. Essentially, all we had at the start were rocks, and rocks are notably very good in tension, or in compression, but terrible in tension. And so, spaces were very small, very enclosed, or it just took a monumental amount of effort to lift these massive rocks into these sort of structures. What we could make was limited by what we had. As technology developed, we started to master these skills and push them to their limits. Started with the column. You can see at the start here, this is the start of a column, where we just have a massive monolith in the ground, and then we have this trabeation where we put something on top of it to create a post and lintel. So, we started to master these skills in Egypt, and then in ancient Greece, we reached the limit of what we could with just rocks. And then more importantly, we innovated new, different technologies. So we have the arch and the dome, and these naturally evolved from what we had previously. And so, again and again, we pushed the limited materials we have to their limits. So as history goes on and we develop more technology, ceilings will get taller, spaces get wider and more open, and rooms get brighter. We're able to take our limited knowledge and apply it to its maximum extent with the technology that we have. You see here, these spaces become as awe-inspiring as they can physically be. These kind of pillars are performing the maximum load to get this chapel to have as much glazing as possible. And this is the limit of what they could do at the time. Then iron shows up with the Industrial Revolution. It's cheap, it's strong, and it's fast, and suddenly What took a ton of people a ton of time to create could be done relatively simply with standardized parts, and thus we were able to create wider, more open, and more light-filled spaces for much, much cheaper and much, much faster. Then, the introduction of steel and later concrete only expedite this growth. From the start, where we had masonry and stone and wood, and we had to cut it and chisel it and have these kind of load-bearing heavy elements, there was only so much you could do with that. But steel and concrete are the two backbones of modern architecture. You can span greater distances, you can have stronger, more compact pillars, you can create whatever shapes you want, and we're granted so much more freedom by these new materials. Today, we can do basically whatever we want with the materials that we have available to us. There's more organic shapes. Architecture is more of an open canvas than it has ever been in any point in human history. So, what are the reasons why architecture of today doesn't look like the architecture of yesterday? One, to create these kind of massive, ornate buildings is very, very time consuming. This is the most contemporary example of one of these sort of massive, awe-inspiring cathedrals, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, designed by Antoni Gaudí, and although the plans were lost midway through, which caused a very long halt in development, this thing has been under construction for about 120 years. It's just incredibly, incredibly time-consuming to create these massive, ornate works of art. And it is expensive. Every single one of these little details needs to be hand-carved by a skilled laborer. And so something that may seem relatively simple if you don't think about it too much, oh, why don't we just add more detail to buildings? It takes a lot of time and a lot of man-hours, and that costs money. And so, especially in today's day, not many people want to spend so much money on a building. Sometimes they're seen as more of a functional piece than really anything that is art. And that sucks. I don't agree with this. I feel like we should be spending more money to create these kind of public works of art. But that is the reality of it. As architects, we kind of have to deal with the limited budgets that we're so often given. And so there's only so much that can be done with that, and sacrifices have to be made. And ornamentation, while it is nice, is not the most essential thing to the working of a building, and it can be replaced while still being aesthetically pleasing. We have different skill sets today. Now, you're not really going to find many talented stonemasons or wood carvers as you would back in the day. That's just not the kind of skill set that we need in today's society. Unfortunately, it also results in these kinds of works and pieces becoming more and more expensive, hard to create. That's not to say that there isn't a value to this trade. It's just that in today's society filled with mass-produced materials and standardized parts, these kind of specialty pieces are few and far between, and most of our skilled labor ends up going into different trades. But what tools we do have, such as CNC milling, 3D printing, can be used to create a different, more unique subset of architecture that highlights the strengths of these new skills. So, a CNC router can do things that no human hand could, and create these really organic, flowing structures out of something that is very rigid. Modern designs are more efficient than they've ever been before. If you had gone back in time and offered the premise of an all-glass building to someone back in the day, they would have gladly taken up on that. The problem is that glass was never very thermally sound, and it also lets in a lot of light and heat that you don't always want. But nowadays, we have the technology to make glass efficient like that. Thanks to double glazing and curtain wall systems, we can have these super tall structures that are clad entirely in glass. That's just not something that was feasible back in the day. But compared to these older buildings that we look up to, these newer buildings that are fully glazed offer a lot more natural light, natural ventilation, and it's just a much better deal for the interior. It serves those goals I talked about in the beginning, where they provide some of the best spaces that we can provide with today's technology. And that also applies to, for example, methods of wall construction. Nowadays, almost every brick wall is not structural. The brick is simply a veneer that is clad onto the actual structure of a building. Look here, back in the day, you would need around 3 bricks width to have kind of an exterior wall, but that wall is solid brick. There's nothing you can put in there. Nowadays, we often use wood or metal studs, which then can fit insulation, wiring, plumbing, and then the brick is clad on as the exterior surface. You may think, like, why would we ever go away from this? But it offers more space and creates a more humane, livable interior that makes better use of the space inside. And we can do so much more with materials now than we could in the past. For example, this is the Vaughn Center for Molecular Studies, designed by Frank Gehry, and he is using brick here on this exterior. Now, if this brick was structural brick, this would never stand up. But because he recognizes that most brick nowadays is just a veneer, he maximizes the use of this. The brick here is just a cladding, and so he can do whatever he wants with the cladding. And so all of these kind of funky angles are able to take shape because the brick is just attached onto the actual structure inside, which is holding the building up. And we need to include modern amenities. In 1940, 40% of households had indoor plumbing. By 1990, that number was 99%. Other things, electricity, HVAC systems, fire safety, and accessibility are also important features that we do need to include in our buildings. And it's often overlooked when you talk about historical architecture, just how much they really thought about safety and amenities. Those things all had to be either retrofitted in, or the building is not up to the same safety standards as something that would be built in the modern day. So why do people say that old buildings are better? Most of it is a kind of survivorship bias. The old buildings that are still around today are the old buildings that are worth keeping around. As such, they're the most artistic, they're the most well constructed, and they have the most cultural value. For every one of these buildings, back in the day, you had hundreds of low quality, inhospitable buildings that were not worth keeping around. People might say that they didn't make them like they used to back in the day, but we also don't make this like we used to back in the day. And the amount of new construction has skyrocketed. We are simply making more and more buildings than we ever have in the past, and as such, our efforts are kind of divided. Something like a cathedral would take around 20% of kind of a town's economy to keep afloat and construct. Nowadays, we're building hundreds of buildings every single day, and so people may think like, oh my god, these new buildings, they just aren't up to the same quality as the ones back in the day. But the reality is that they were focusing more on a smaller subset of buildings for the very wealthy and, royalty, the church, people with a lot of money who could afford to build these massive buildings, compared to kind of these smaller clients that do not have as much but are able to create something that is of the same quality in today's day. It's disingenuous to compare the super projects of yesterday with the mundane buildings of today. Something like the Taj Mahal, which is universally regarded as a beautiful work of architecture, took 20 years to build and cost $1 billion in today's money. It's unfair to look at these monumental projects commissioned by the literal rulers of nations to something as simple as a housing project built in small town USA. Instead, it should be compared to these larger projects, like, for example, the Parliament Building of Australia in Canberra. This also cost just shy of $1 billion in today's money, and you can see the kind of attention to detail and the monumentality of architecture has not gone away. It's just that there is so much new architecture that we kind of we're comparing apples to oranges when we should be comparing apples to apples. Timeless works of architecture are still being built. This is the Brooklyn Tower by Shop Architects, and this is a monumental landmark piece of architecture that I think will stand the test of time. You can see the kind of clear influences it brings with those vertical lines really ties itself into New York City. Not every work of architecture is going to be celebrated, put on a poster for years to come, but that's not to say that there aren't beautiful works of architecture being made. They are, and they're happening all around us, and at a greater frequency than ever. So what do people really mean when they say we need to return to tradition? Two things can be true. One is that the public has shown a renewed interest in more detailed buildings, kind of a shy away from the minimalist modernist movement of the mid-20th century. And the desire to go back to the way things were is also just entrenched in racist rhetoric. Traditional architecture is used as a dog whistle for white supremacists. There are many of these kinds of accounts online that paint modernism as this kind of evil stain on society, and then paint the past as this beautiful thing that we all need to return to. But that is viewing the past through rose-colored glasses. Architecture is the built representation of a society's values, and there is a reason. Architecture is the built representation of a society's values. Oftentimes, we'll see these kind of authoritarian regimes try and use a callback to a previous greater power, like Rome, and use these kinds of neoclassical styles to paint themselves in the same light that they want to be seen, with the strong authoritarian power. And that is not, going back to those styles is not it's not a way to reclaim the past. The past is in the past, and when we're building architecture in the modern age, we need to represent the modern people's values and we need to represent the modern people's values within the built environment itself. And there's a reason that only these kind of European architecture is really shown in these types of posts. They're entrenched in a kind of white supremacy that calls back to the supposed origin cultures as these kinds of infallible, perfect things that we need to return to, and not the true reality of the past, which is that there was great, great wealth inequality. They're really only showing what the most elite top of society really had access to and was building. The reality is that by cherry-picking these examples, they're creating an idealized past that does not exist, but it serves only to paint modern society as inadequate compared to the idealized what has been. There is no ideal past to return to. The only purpose of this movement is to insinuate that some cultures are better than others. So, how should we move into the future? Styles will come and go. The arts and crafts movement was kind of the arts and crafts movement kind of came alongside these kind of more minimalist movements, and the two did not exist separately. People have certain preferences for one or the other, but both of them exist within the modern movement. They're both modern styles. The arts and crafts movement did not attempt to go back and recreate the past. It took the context of the modern movement and applied this kind of greater attention to detail to it. More ornament just simply does not make something better. For example, here in the White House, you can see that kind of the cleanness has been erased by this kind of attention to ornament and decoration as these kinds of more is more. And that's not always the case. There has to be a line drawn between what is aesthetically beautiful and using kind of like beautiful ornamented things as a replacement for taste, which is simply not the case. And it does really suck that most buildings nowadays are made as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible. There are a lot of buildings that just really are not remarkable. And that is not a new thing. That is how 99% of buildings have been throughout history. The fact of the matter is that for many people, architecture is an afterthought and buildings serve as function first. It's not fair to judge something that did not have artistic merit behind it with the same level of intensity as something as grand as a great work of architecture from the past. That's not to say that we shouldn't be putting more effort into these, but that there are always going to be different contexts behind the reason a building was constructed, and they're not fully representative of architecture as a whole. And the way to create beautiful architecture is not to try and replicate the past. There's a difference between a revival and a reproduction. So, for example, the Gothic revival, which came about the end of the 1800s, start of the 1900s, was not just people rebuilding exactly as they did in the Gothic style. It was more of the borrowing of certain elements, certain styles, and combining them with the modern context to create a new style. Never has it ever been feasible to just go back and build things the way they exactly were. Unless you're working at unless you're creating some kind of deliberate timepiece or museum exhibit, something that documents the time period as it was, that's obviously reasonable. But for the purposes of architecture, there is no point in going back and making things from a previous time period with inferior technology. The ugliest thing you can do is to create this kind of fake old, or try and borrow things from styles without really appreciating what makes them work. And we see this a lot with these kind of McMansions, where they copy Greek columns, pull them way out of proportion, really pull everything out of proportion, or just borrow a mishmash of different pieces from different styles without any regard to the history behind them and how they really fit in to the greater work as a whole. And you cannot replace real materials with fake ones. And one of the biggest pet peeves I have are these stick-on veneers that are meant to emulate some kind of material. Like, for example, this stick-on stone. And, a real cobblestone wall is made from, found material that's either, stacked mortarless or cut to and then mortared to create a wall. And so that has thickness, it has weight, and having this fake veneer that you then punch windows into willy-nilly, it reads so fake and so ugly because it pays no attention to the history behind the materials and how they work. It just, looks at the past, sees it for its face value, and tries to emulate it to no avail. It's ugly. Contemporary architecture should read as such. This is a great building by GBBN in the historic Over the Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati, and it doesn't attempt to just look like the older buildings. The materials and the kind of organization of the windows fits in, but you would not mistake this for an old building. It is a new building that sits in this old context, and that is how we should be treating architecture as we move forward into the future. We should never try and recreate what was. We should be mindful of the context of an area and work within that, but create something to the maximum of our abilities. And we need to make the most of the tools available to us. And one of the most powerful tools is the computer-assisted computer-assisted design softwares that we have available to us. It includes Rhino, Grasshopper, CAD, Revit. All of these allow us to push architecture further than we ever have before, and truly innovative works of architecture should be maximizing this and putting everything we have to its fullest extent, just as we have throughout all of human history. There is no shame in borrowing ideas from history, but progress can never be made by trying to recreate the past. And so it's obviously fine to love old buildings. I love old buildings, but we can never ever recreate them exactly the way they were. The historical context of the time is gone. We don't work with the same technology. We don't have the same lived experiences. The way work works isn't the same. And to try and go back to the way things were is just unfeasible. We need to continue to move forward as a society. And thank you guys for watching. Now, this was a little ranty, but this is a video I've wanted to make for a long time. So if you enjoyed and you love architecture, leave a like and be sure to subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.